Well, good morning. On behalf of the Alberta Conference, we want to extend greetings to all of you, those who are serving there. Of course, there's Keith Richter, who's our treasurer, and Wayne Williams is the secretary, and all of the others. We want to extend our greetings. You know, coming here today and driving here brought a flood of memories back to me. And if you'd indulge me for a moment, I'll share with you. It was 35 years ago in September that Elmira and I began this journey called ministry. This was the very first place that we were assigned to, was here. And I remember distinctly coming. I was just into my 20s, and Elmira was still a teenager when we came here. And at the time, this was viewed as a large church. It's still a bigger church, but it was viewed from our perspective, it was a humongous church. It was early in our experience. We had grown up in Newfoundland. We had gone to a small congregation. There were about 30 of us who made up the little church where I was a member as I began. And so the very first Sabbath here, we drove from the northeast down this way, and we were making our way to this congregation. And so my wife had seen the building the day before on a Friday. We had arrived in town on Friday. And the next day, the head elder asked us if I would take the sermon. And of course, I was happy to do that. But coming here, I remember distinctly, my wife did not want to come here. This was a frightening and intimidating place for a girl from Newfoundland who had attended only small congregations before. So we were there. At the time, there was a church not very far, just a few blocks from here. It was the Ukrainian church. I don't know if any of you remember, but there was a Ukrainian church just a few blocks to the east of us. And she said, I am not going to Central. Drop me off here. I'm going to the Ukrainian church. She'd never been there before either, but anyway, that's where she wanted to go. So we came into the parking lot in tears and about to face the folks of Edmonton Central for the first time. And all I can say is that were some faces still here today that we met that morning. Anybody attend here back in the mid-'80s when I was here? Yes, there are several people who were here at that time. And yes, I remember the faces as I see the hands go up. And so we got acquainted with some of the folks here, and of course they were very gracious and very generous toward us and very kind. And we had just arrived, as I said. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I must stop reminiscing. But we came here, and I'll tell you the truth. We had gotten married that summer in June when college was over. I had spent every dime I had trying to get through CUC, and so we were just starting. And when we arrived in Edmonton, we had about $1,200 to our name. And it was $500 for the first month's rent and $500 for the damage deposit for the place where we stayed up there in Londonderry or wherever it was. And so we were broke. But we had a place to stay at least. And so Elmira got a job working at a daycare. And, of course, I started my ministry here. And so we began, and there were a family here, the Gascoignes. I don't know if any of you remember Norm and Mary and the family and so forth. And you know, they were smart, and they were very, very kind and very generous. We had a place, all right, but we had nowhere. We actually got a couple sleeping bags for each other for our wedding anniversary, because my wife, our wedding. Because my wife liked to camp. I wasn't so big into camping, but anyway, so we had 2 sleeping bags, and that was our bed for the first month. We threw it on the carpet upstairs, and that's where we slept. and we ate off the counter because we didn't have a table. But we went to visit these folks. And by the way, we didn't care. We really didn't care. We knew that stuff would come in time. We were just happy with each other and happy with life, and we didn't care about the rest of it. And that's how our life began. But we went to the Gascoignes for dinner. I think it was the first or second week we were here. It was almost immediately. And so they asked us, how we were doing. And we said, well, we got this place. We're staying there. And Mary must have asked, how are you doing for furnishings? And we said, we're doing fine. We don't have anything at this point. And she said to us, it just so happens that we are renovating our basement. And we got all this stuff down there, and we need to get it out of there so we can renovate and not have all this clutter. And so she made it sound like we were doing her a great favor to take the couch and the chairs and all the furnishings that were there. So out of the goodness of our heart, we accommodated them. And that was our furnishings first. But the people here were endearing folk. We got acquainted with them. We served in the Sabbath school and all the different things. And we thoroughly enjoyed it, our experience here. It was one of the highlights of our life. So I stopped talking about that now because one could get emotional reminiscing about all of that sort of thing. But the church was a dear congregation to us. This morning I want to share with you a story. I've been reading the book of Acts again. Acts is probably my favorite book in the Bible. And a reason I chose it, I was reading it again. The very first Sabbath I was here, 35 years and a couple months ago, I spoke from the book of Acts. And I thought, well, I'm going to do the same. Of course, there's always the danger that people will remember what I said 35 years ago. But no, it's a different passage. And so I just wanted to be safe. So I want to turn with you to chapter 3 of the book of Acts. It's a story, and it's a story that speaks to us about the miraculous and about compassion and so forth. I'm going to read it to you. It's 10 or 11 verses. Normally I don't read that much, but I'll read some of it at least. Acts chapter 3, it says this. Now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was the hour of prayer. And a certain man who had been lame from his mother's womb was being carried along, whom they used to set down every day at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, in order to beg alms of those who were entering the temple. And when he saw Peter and John about to go into the temple, he began asking to receive alms from them. And Peter, along with John, fixed his gaze upon him and said, "Look at us." And he began to give them his attention, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, "I do not possess silver and gold, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, walk." And seizing him by the right hand, he raised him up, and immediately his feet and his ankles were straightened. And with a leap he stood upright and began to walk, and he entered the temple with them, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God. And they were taking note of him, being the one who used to sit at the beautiful gate of the temple to beg alms. Now, I read this passage in Acts chapter 3, and I'll be very honest with you that healings are one of the things that I tend to be the most cautious about, and perhaps even sometimes skeptical about. The reason being is that I hear so much about televangelists and folks like that who it appears preys upon the needs of other people. A few years ago, not very long ago, W5, I think it was, did a big expose on Benny Hinn and all those folk. And you remember, there was a sad, sad evening watching that program because Benny Hinn, you know, has this big ministry, but when they began to look up the people who were supposedly healed that evening, they discovered that there were no changes in those people. What made it even sadder was that they reported that Benny Hinn, it was basically a money gathering affair. And Benny Hinn, the night when he stayed at the crusade, just before they interviewed him, he stayed at a place where he rented a room out for $10,000 a night. And that's where Benny Hinn stayed. Mansions, you know, that's all he knew. And so I was skeptical. I remember other incidents as well. Oral Roberts back in the day would do the same. I remember one day expressly remembering my brother-in-law, who wasn't well, was watching Oral Roberts, and Oral Roberts put his hand on the TV screen, and he said, "If you will send me," I forget how many dollars it was, "if you will commit to sending this pledge to me, just place your hand against mine on the TV screen, and you will be healed." I remember that. Of course, you know, my brother-in-law did it, but there was no change in him afterward. When I was just starting ministry, a little bit later than here, I left here. I was here for 2 years. That's all they could take of me. No, it was time to go to the seminary. And so I went down there, spent a couple of years, 2.5 years down there, went back to Sylvan Lake and Rocky Mountain House. When I was in Rocky Mountain House one particular day, we had just done a series of meetings. And the meetings had gone very well. For a little town, I think we had 12 baptisms. Amongst them was a family by the name of the Malners. And they still attend there. I was there not so long ago. And their girls and their son and so forth. And he came to me, it was early on, he was a brand new member of the Rocky Mountain House Church, and he said to me, he said, "I have a neighbor, and the neighbor has invited me to go along to a faith healing meeting." And it was, you know, one of these folk who came to town, traveling evangelists who were doing the healing ministry. Asked me if I would go. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't want to go. I am skeptical about these kinds of experiences. But I was also afraid for my new member. And so I had to make a choice. For my own self, I would not go. But for him, I knew that there was danger. He was a brand new member. How would he be influenced by this faith healer? And so I went to the meetings. The one night. Went when it was there. So it was a big hall, kind of like this, maybe not quite as big as this. And so I went there, and this fellow, you know, there was a lot of music, a lot of rousing, very intense music that evening. And then the evangelist got up and to share. And after he had said some things, he entered into this prayer time when people could come to be healed. And of course, he had deacons and so forth. And so I was watching the crowd. I was sitting probably where Pastor Wesley is. I was watching the crowd there that evening. And of course, people came forward. Most people came forward with things, you know, you wouldn't be able to verify whether it was legitimate or not. People came forward, they had a bad stomach. And some others had a headache, and some others had something else. But I did notice there was a person sitting near the front, and this person was disfigured. I've never seen it before or after, but he had a skin condition, and it was His skin was all full of large bumps. It was almost like I don't know, a rough tire or something. It had all over him. You could see it. I mean, it was huge. And so he was disfigured. It was so much all over his face and all over his arms and hands. And he kept asking to come forward. And the evangelist would not acknowledge him, wouldn't welcome him to the front. Only others. He would choose others because people put up their hands, right? He would choose people, but he would not choose this person. Even though he was right there in front of him, he would not allow him to come forward. And so I thought to myself, that did not do a whole lot to buoy my faith in this practice that he was having that particular evening. This passage here, Acts chapter 3, is about a miracle. You've just heard the story. Peter and John were going to the temple to pray, and there was a person there who had been sick for so long and so forth. You have heard. So this particular passage gives us several good markers, if you will, to determine whether or not a miracle is a legitimate one or not, whether it's something real or whether it is something disingenuous. And so it gives you several factors, several markers to do that. So let's look at this for a moment. I want to give you a little bit of background information on Acts chapter 3. You'll better understand the setting for this particular occurrence. Acts chapter 2 had just occurred, and you remember the story of Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost and Peter's great sermon, and 2,000 were converted in a day. Well, this is Acts chapter 3, but it is 1 year later, almost exactly. So the book of Acts, as most books, you would think from reading them that they all happened in the course of a few days, but it was over many, many years the book of Acts was written. And so it was 1 year later since the day of Pentecost. It was Peter and John were going to the temple to pray. It says it was the 9th hour, so that translated, they began their day at 6 in the morning. It was a 12-hour daylight and a 12-hour nighttime. So it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and Jewish folk were prone to go to the church 3 times a day there. Of course, Psalms 55 refers to that experience and that request. Of the times when you could go to the temple, 3 o'clock in the afternoon was the time when most people would be present. You know how it is in our Adventist church. You can go to Sabbath school, at least here in North America, and there's usually a smaller crowd than there is for church. You can go to midweek service. There's usually a smaller crowd to midweek service. So for us, it is this hour, 11 o'clock Sabbath morning. For them, the prayer time was 3 in the afternoon. That's when almost everyone was present. The largest crowds, time when the most people would witness this particular healing. Now, when they arrived, going to the Temple Mount, there were beggars, people who were there asking for money. Elmira and I were in Jerusalem a couple of years back, and still, when you go to the Temple Mount, you will find beggars there. There were people there when we were. I remember an older lady sitting in a chair with a cup. She didn't even look at us because it was sunny and bright. She would just shake it as people would go by. And so it was very, very common then. It's still very common today. Now, this particular beggar had to be assisted to get to this location. He was about 40 years of age. If you continue reading in Acts chapter 4, I believe verse 22, it mentions that he's about 40 years of age there. And he's placed at one of the 4 main gates going to the Temple Mount, into the city. He is at the eastern gate, or the gate they call the Gate Beautiful, because it was made of this Corinthian bronze. By the way, The eastern gate today this gate is boarded up. And it's bricked in with Jerusalem stone, and it is still the gate they believe that Jesus will enter the city of Jerusalem through at the second coming. So they believe that. So we saw the gate, but it's boarded up today. You get in there from different entrances. This gate was magnificent, but it was also large. It took about 20 people to close it. And he had been brought to this gate. It was a thoroughfare, how people got into the city. He had been brought to this gate for nearly on 40 years. He was a cripple. But he wasn't just a cripple. He was a deformed cripple. His legs were not straight. They were twisted and gnarled. His ankles were bent in. His knees were almost dislocated. And so they were deformed besides not being useful to him. And so he was a regular fixture. They saw him every day. People brought him, and he begged for alms there. And so one of the indications, one of the markers is that if a healing is a genuine one, it will be obvious from the experience of the person that they are in need. This person, they had saw him every single day for 40 years there, and they knew that he was deformed, crippled, and so healing of this man, there would be no mistaking it. This was not a headache he was being cured of. This was something that was chronic and long-term and evident to all that this would be a miraculous transformation. Now, the New Testament indicates there are 3 places you can go if you want to be successful at begging alms, you know. And they're places like you would expect. They were places where, the streets would be the main drags of town, if you will. Most people would go by. Those were good spots to go. There was also the front porch of the estates of the wealthy. That was also a good place to go because the wealthy often invited people to their homes for entertainment and the like. And so they always almost insisted on having a couple beggars or people outside because it would give the owner an opportunity to show off his generosity. And so they would go there. And the third place was to the temple gate itself. And the reason is obvious, of course, and that is those who are coming to worship God always brought with them an offering. It also gave them, the pious, an opportunity to show how responsive they were to God's blessing in their lives by how they would give to others. And so we find him there at the temple gate, the eastern gate. This man, it says, eventually it would say that his legs were straightened. So they were deformed. He lived in despair for these 40 years already. He did not know what normal was. He was taken physically everywhere he would go. He could go nowhere without their help. He completely relied on the handouts and the generosity and the grace of others. He was used to accepting grace from people. He was accustomed to that. His primary purpose was simply to survive. He had no other means of support other than begging. So Peter and John approached, and he calls out, as he had done countless other times, begging for alms, alms for the poor. I can remember hearing it rehearsed in my mind as we were on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, seeing the poor there. I could tell you some of the stories about some of the people who came up to us, but I'm reluctant to get into that because that'll be a diversion. But he felt a surge of hope when he saw Peter and John. And the reason is that Peter and John said to him, "Look at us. Look at us." Very significant. Because you see, when you don't want to like for instance, if you're going through a store and there's a vendor there selling something or wanting you to donate to something, if you are not interested, what do? You turn your head the other way. You ignore them, even though they're a foot and a half away from you. You look the other way or look at your shoes or the ceiling or something, but you don't look at them. You avoid contact with them. But Peter and John said, look at us. And they were focused on him, and he thought to himself, well, they're paying attention to me. This means that I can expect that they're going to be generous toward me, and they're going to offer a significant amount of funds in one form or another. And so he looks at them. Peter said, however, silver and gold I do not have. He said, in essence, I don't have stuff that you can put in your cup. I don't have the stuff that will buy clothes for you. I don't have the stuff that you can go out and buy food with after. But even though I don't have silver and gold, what I do have, I will give to you. And of course, I imagine the cripple is thinking, if they have no money, what could they possibly offer to me? And he says, Peter says, in the name of Jesus, be well. Get up. And what's interesting is that immediately it says Peter bent over, grabbed him by the arm, and began to lift him up. Now think about what that means for a moment. This guy is in a heap on the floor. He has never walked from the day he was born. His legs are gnarled and twisted and bent. His ankles are misshapen. His knees are not in the right order. The muscles are not formed properly. Sinews won't hold you in place. And they grab him by the arm and begin to lift him to his feet. And the Bible says that his legs began to straighten as they lift him up. That's an amazing thing to me because it's not a simple thing. It's not a simple thing. In that moment, his actual entire structure of his legs had to change. We have a lady who's our accountant in the office, payroll person, and Kim LaBelle. You know Kim, I'm sure. And Kim has a husband. His name is Ken LaBelle. And Ken had a motorcycle accident when he was younger. And the motorcycle accident left him so that his leg was no longer straight. It went to the knee and then bowed to the right. So it was a very awkward way. And eventually his knee wore out. So he had to go just not long ago, in the last 8 months since I've been here, to get surgery. They were going to replace the knee, but they said we can't replace the knee unless we also straighten the leg. And straightening the leg is no easy feat. They would have to cut the tendons and the muscles and straighten the bone and then reattach them all. And after it was over, they said to him, now you have to be careful because your leg will want to go back the way it was before. And you have to be conscious of it, that you always walk and be mindful that you have to keep your leg straight or it'll go right back to what it was before. This leper, this cripple, would have had the same kinds of things. Bones and everything was twisted, but he went to his feet with the help of Peter. And it doesn't say that he slowly, have you ever, you watch your child, they're learning to walk. And it takes a while. You wobble and you fall and you tip over and you try to get your balance. You go backwards and forwards and sideways. And he had his balance and his equilibrium and everything was given to him as a gift. As he began to stand, you could hear perhaps the creaking and the crunching of the bones and the tendons as they were straightening up to allow him the ability to walk. then it says here, this is another identifier of this particular miracle. The fellow who was healed naturally began to praise and jump and so forth and give credit to Peter and John for the miracle, didn't he? He wanted to do that. He wanted to say, look at these great people and the miracle they've done, and they're powerful. And Peter, what does he say in verse 11 and 12? And while he was clinging to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them at the so-called portico of Solomon, full of amazement. But when Peter saw this, he replied to the people, men of Israel, why do you marvel at this? Or why do you gaze at us as if by our own power or piety we had made him walk? And so the second sermon of Peter is the next rest of the book and into chapter 4, where he explains it has nothing to do with us. He diverts all the attention and all of the credit to Jesus. That's the second thing of a genuine miracle. There will be no monetary gain for those who share, who are the instruments of God's grace. There will be no $10,000 a night hotel rooms. There will be no chauffeurs driving limousines all over the place for you. It will not be like that. All the credit will go where it belongs, and that is to God and God alone. Third thing that is noticed here is that the purpose of this healing, by the way, was not an end in itself. It was only a means to an end. You see, Peter took the occasion. Yes, the man needed to be physically healed, but more importantly, he and thousands of others around needed to be healed spiritually. It was only a means to an end. It was not an end in itself. They didn't go from the meeting and the miracle was the key thing. It never was. It was never about that. It was never about that when Jesus performed any of the miracles that he did. It was not the case when Peter and John performed this miracle. It was only an occasion to open people's eyes so that they could be directed to the Savior of mankind. And in this particular setting, to Jesus explicitly. That is the reason. So we don't go, and we need to remember this, that genuine healings are not about just going and being healed. We only live a few years and we die anyway. So what's the big deal about that? But we can live eternally if we're directed to Christ and his salvation. Well, I don't want to take a lot more time with this, but I do want to say this to you, and I will share two very short stories. They could be long, but I'm going to tell them short. I believe in miracles still to this day. I do. I've seen them. I have seen on numerous occasions where it is more than just coincidence, more than just happenstance. I've seen it. I'll share one story when I was a pastor of a church. And this was in Sylvan Lake. This particular situation occurred. There was a bunch of teenagers from our congregation who were up at the college, going to the college, either for high school, probably high school, maybe first year university. I don't remember which anymore. And we got a call from one of the young girls. Her name was Cammie. And she was up at the school. And they had gone to Banff for the weekend on one of these outings or whatever they call them, field trips. And so they were there. In the 80s, there was a thing going on in Alberta where young people were being affected by a disease. It was a meningitis disease. But it only affected the teenagers, that age group, roughly. I don't know if anybody remembers that happening, but it was a big deal. Yes, it was a big deal. Several people in Edmonton died, and you didn't last long with this. When you got it, it was 24 to 48 hours and it was over, and you were gone. And so I got a phone call as the pastor from this young girl's father, who was a member of our congregation, and he said that his daughter had just been taken to Foothills Hospital in Calgary, and they had diagnosed her with this meningitis thing, and they didn't think she would last a night. Young kids were dying fast, very quickly, with this ailment, and several people had already been in the news from Edmonton and so on. And so he asked if we would pray for her. So it was an afternoon. I forget, it was 3 o'clock or something he called. And so I called several of the deacons and asked if they would contact all the church members. And that at 6 o'clock, I remember, 6 o'clock, we would have a season of prayer for this young lady. And so most everybody came who could come, who were available. And even many made themselves available and came. So it was a big group of people. And so we prayed for her, sang some songs and her favorite verses. And you know how that goes. And some testimonies and things like that. And so it came time for it to be over. It was, I don't remember, 7:30 when we finished. And I remember going home. And I just got to the doorsteps, walking up and opened the door. I hadn't taken off my shoes or my coat or anything. And the phone rang. And it was the young girl's father. And he wanted to report that about 10 minutes before I got to the door of my house, just after leaving the church, he said his daughter had come out of the coma that she was in, and that the doctors felt she would survive now. And it was quite miraculous. I remember how moving a story that was. And so, you can't help but believe that God exercises real miracles and real things in people's lives. Second story I'm very reticent to tell you, and I can only look at this side of the congregation when I tell this story, so I will keep it very brief, as I'll try to remember as least of it as possible. But it was, we were in Newfoundland by now, so pastoring the St. John's Church. Myra and I have been blessed with 5 children. And the oldest one lives and works in Hinton. The next one attended Berman there and finished and works in that area. She's doing her master's degree now while she's working. And so on. Those are our children. But the youngest one is at Berman today. She's 21. She's just turned 21 in September. She's in her 3rd year of science, their biology. She wants to be a veterinarian, so that's what she's doing. But when this little girl was 7 months old, we noticed that something was not right. It just wasn't going like the other children had grown and developed. Something was happening. She was losing her appetite. Her stomach looked distended, and we said, well, this is not normal. This is not what we recall from the other times. So my wife took her to the hospital, and they said, don't worry about it. It's just babies, And but we were concerned, and then a little later we took her back again, and the same thing was said, but we said, no, that's not right. Something is not normal here. So he said, well, just to put you at ease, I will send her over to whatever department, and they'll do a CAT scan or whatever it was they did. And so I wasn't there. I remember where I was, at the office or someplace. But I do remember getting a phone call. And the phone call was that this little girl who's 7 months old had cancer. And so I asked, so what kind of cancer is this? And they said it was liver cancer. And it was fairly well along. And so not sure what to expect. Well, I will not share with you the details because they are too emotional for me, but I will summarize what happened. For the next 4 months, of course, there was all these rounds of chemotherapy. And so if you do one round, it would last for 3 weeks but right afterwards, she couldn't eat anymore. So I was at the hospital every single day from about breakfast time until about supper time. And then my wife would be there from about supper time all the way around to breakfast time again. For a year, she slept at the hospital. For 4 months, we went through this. And so then they had to do surgery on the liver. Apparently, the liver is in lobes, and this was restricted to one of the lobes. And they were going to do surgery, but they did not have a team adequate in Newfoundland to do this. So we had to leave the province to be able to have access to a team that could even try this. And so the surgery, we went through all of that, and she survived. And we went back to Newfoundland. It was another 4 rounds of chemotherapy. And when she was 18 months old, she only weighed about 10 pounds. And so I remember many times praying. Of course, we prayed for her every single day, several times a day, and asked God to intervene. I remember one day they let us out occasionally for a few hours, coming home to the house and walking into the nursery where the crib was and all of that, and thinking to myself, well, it could very well be that we will not have an opportunity to raise this child ourselves in this lifetime. And you finally come to that conclusion after you've been through enough of it. And so you totally just give it up and give it away and stop it. Because you are so drained and so emotional and so exhausted that you can't take it anymore. And I remember that day vividly for me. I just said, okay, I'm willing to let it go. And that's how it will be. But we continued to pray. And the reason I believe in miracles is because it wasn't long and she recovered. When it was over, I remember vividly, she went from 10 or 11 pounds in the next 1 month to almost doubling her weight. She ate everything in sight. I mean, it was dangerous to put your arm near her. And the next month, she gained another 50% of her weight, and then she normalized. Thank goodness. And but now she's a beautiful young girl, 21 years of age, third-year university, and God chose to allow her to live. But even if He had not, I would have still been content. And knowing that there would be a day coming when we could be restored and we could make up, for lost time. So I still believe in miracles. I hope that you do as well. May God bless you richly in your experience, that you will have that faith that will sustain you for this life and into the life to come. God bless you.